In the first video that I made, I basically gave an overview of the doctrine of the Trinity. In this video, I want to cover some of those concepts that I spoke about in slightly more detail. And the first concept I want to talk about is this distinction between being and person. I mentioned that if the doctrine of the Trinity affirmed that God was one person and three persons, or one being and three beings, then it would be a contradiction. But the doctrine of the Trinity affirms that God is one being in three persons. There is a distinction between being and personhood. And for that reason, the doctrine of the Trinity can't immediately be written off as a contradiction. What is this distinction between being and personhood then? Well, William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland use a helpful analogy. And though in the first video I mentioned that all analogies break down somewhere, that doesn't mean that analogies aren't helpful in certain places. The analogy that they use is with the Greek dog Cerberus, who has three heads. And the idea is that the Greek dog Cerberus is one being with three centres of self-consciousness, three dog heads with three dog brains, and so three centres of self-consciousness. And if personhood isn't too far off what we mean when we talk about a self-conscious agent, then it seems clear that there is a distinction between being and person, so that we can talk of God without contradicting ourselves by saying that he is one being in three persons, or three centres of self-consciousness. Now, I would immediately qualify this by saying that the kind of personhood that we see in God isn't identical to human personhood, but I think there's enough similarity there to be able to vindicate the Trinitarian from any charges of contradiction. So there's a distinction between being and personhood. The second thing that I wanted to talk about in this video is how the three persons are one. How is it that the three persons are one God instead of being three gods? Well, we've talked about the distinction between being and personhood. And one of the typical ways that's been used to understand what we mean by being is the idea of substance. And substances are basically those things that possess properties and stand in relations to things. So, for example, the dog Fido possesses the property of brownness. God is one substance that exemplifies the property of tripersonality. God isn't three substances, each exemplifying the property of personhood and then somehow related. God is one being or substance in three persons. Why believe that? Well, as we've seen in the first video, that kind of idea of God as being one substance, one being, is warranted and argued for in Scripture. So the first thing that unifies them, the three persons, is this idea of substance. The second way that we might speak of the persons being unified is what's called perichoresis, or mutual indwelling. The three persons share all of their properties that they have in common. So, for example, there aren't three instances of omniscience or omnipresence or omnipotence. The three share that one property. And as well as that, they are united in will and in love. So perichoresis is the idea that they are sharing these properties that they have in common, but also that they're willing in the exact same way. They will the same thing. And the third way that we can talk about the unity of the three persons is in virtue of what's called inseparable operation. When any of the persons act, so do the other two persons. So when we talk about the Spirit giving gifts, we don't mean to exclude the Father and the Son. Both the Father and the Son and the Spirit are all involved in giving gifts. Admittedly, they might be involved in different ways, but when one person does something, the other persons are involved. So there are three ways we might understand the Trinity and the three persons as being one. Firstly, in virtue of substance. Secondly, in virtue of perichoresis. And thirdly, in virtue of what's called inseparable operation. So that is just some of the questions I wanted to answer with this second video, and I hope that's been helpful and perhaps clarified some of the things I said in the first. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.